Hello and welcome back to another episode of Agritecture's travel-free digital conference. My name is Henry Gordon-Smith. I'm founder and CEO of Agritecture Consulting, and I'm so happy you're joining us today. Today's episode is a special episode. We are actually doing this in partnership with Food in the Capital. Food in the Capital is an Australia-based event happening in Canberra, the capital of Australia. It's an event that was supposed to happen actually this April. I was going to be speaking at it as one of the keynotes and joined by several amazing speakers from Australia and around the world. Unfortunately, due to COVID-19, the event was postponed. It's going to be happening in September, but we're really excited to partner with Food in the Capital to promote and share the ideas of some of the amazing speakers. So today I'm going to be speaking with Charlie Prell. He's the Deputy Chair of Farmers for Climate Action and based out of New South Wales, based not far from Canberra itself. And he's gonna be talking to us about some of the work that his organization does. How are you doing, Charlie?
Hi, I'm very well. How are you?
Yeah, I'm doing great, thanks. I guess we're in totally different time zones, but it's nice that we're able to connect through technology and share some ideas. I'm really looking forward to your presentation. So coming up soon, Charlie's going to be presenting. And if you like this episode of Agriculture's Travel-Free Digital Conference, be sure to give us a like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And you can see all of the past videos up to date with this video. We already have 20 new videos online available. You can find them at agritecture.com/digital-conference, and you can find them at youtube.com/agritecture. So again, really excited to meet you, Charlie, and let's talk about your presentation, and then we'll follow up with some questions.
Terrific. Thanks for the introduction, Henry. This is a wonderful opportunity to get our message to a wider audience than I'm used to. I understand the difficulties of different time zones. It's been interesting. So I'll just move on straight into sharing my screen and give you a quick summary of who we are and what we do. I'm Charlie Prell. I'm a sheep farmer as well as being Deputy Chair of Farmers for Climate Action. I live about an hour north of Canberra, the capital of Australia, as you said, which is on the east coast of Australia. Farmers for Climate Action is a unique organisation because we're farmers, but we're also really passionate advocates for meaningful action on climate change in Australia. The debate about climate change and what to do about it has been very divisive and often quite toxic, very toxic in Australia. That doesn't mean that there are people like us in rural Australia who are really strongly advocating for serious action to address climate change, both within this country and globally. So that's who we are. We have a website. This is me. Part of our remit is to agitate, to be an activist organisation. There's been debate about activists around the world. I think activism is a really important part of global change, of social change, because that's what activists are. They're people who are agitating for social or political change. As I said, there's been a really divisive debate in this country, not only about the reality of climate change, but what to do about it, to the point where we've had 7 prime ministers in a little over 15 years, and that's just untenable. So this is a few screenshots of our group. We're very diverse. We're nationally represented. We have members from each country in each state in Australia. And as I said, we're activists as well as farmers. We also have connections, international connections, which is really important for us as an organisation. But as you know, climate change is a global issue and we need global action on climate change. We have a mission, and it's here. It's all on our website, this stuff. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly so I can interact with the listeners. But our website is farmersforclimateaction.org.au. We have a mission, but we also have a theory of change because our mission is also all about change. And to achieve that change, we think you need a theory of change. So we're organising and trying to get farmers and rural Australians to influence politicians in the agricultural sector to implement solutions for climate. In addition to that, we have a strategic plan because we have an objective. We need to have a plan of how to get there. Our strategic plan, I'm not going to go into this in any detail, but our strategic plan is focused on 4 areas. They're all outlined in our website. They're there for the headlines are there for your readers to follow up on. And I won't go into them anymore at the moment, except to say in focus area 2, part of the debate in Australia has been about what do we do with the mining industry in Australia. A critical part of resolving that issue is to talk about a just energy transition. So a just transition for workers in the mining industry, but also a just transition for people who are potentially farmers who are going to host renewable energy infrastructure that will build out the renewable energy infrastructure that's desperately needed in Australia. The reason that that is so important, I'll just go forward one slide. The reason that is so important is that 80%, more than 80% of the emissions in Australia are from energy, electricity, stationary energy, transport, and fugitive emissions. So unless we tackle that challenge, there's not much point talking about anything else we do, because those four areas are responsible for 80% of the emissions in Australia. These are from the 2018 emissions profile. That's the latest data that we have in Australia, unfortunately. So it's just going back one slide. One of the things that we're really, really strongly engaged with is teaching farmers, the one on the bottom right of this graph, teaching farmers how to manage their farming systems so they're actually managing climate smart agricultural systems. Because even if we stopped emissions right now, today, there are still impacts from climate change that are already affecting farmers in Australia, and they will only get worse as the climate changes. So our farmers, our food fibre producers, need to be trained to be climate smart in agriculture. In a little over 2 years, we've already trained more than 1,000 farmers to be climate smart farmers. We think that's a really important part of our mission going forward. So I've seen that slide. In addition to having a strategic plan, we also commissioned the Australian Farm Institute, which is a research organisation in Australia, to develop a publication which is called the National Strategy on Climate Change and Agriculture. That's because we've got a plan, we've got a series of solutions, but we need a strategy to implement those solutions, both on the ground, but also to advocate for those solutions politically. This photo was taken with a group of our leading change makers in Parliament House in Sydney, in Canberra last year, before the COVID-19 impact. So just quickly, the Australian land sector faces unprecedented challenges from climate change. We're already experiencing those challenges now. Everybody around the world saw the horrific images through the last 6 months of the summer that we didn't want to have in Australia, but we were inevitably going to have: the bushfires, the smoke, etc. Now those challenges, those bushfires were very, very graphically demonstrated. There was also a creeping impact, which was much more devastating than the bushfires, believe it or not, called drought. And drought in Australia is part of our system, but the severity and the intensity of drought events in Australia are definitely increasing as we move into a more volatile climate. So that leads directly to biodiversity loss, which is really important. It also, very, very importantly, leads to flatlining productivity, in fact, reduction in productivity in a lot of cases. Those issues are hurting us right now. So this is not about our children or our grandchildren, it's about us and our generation. So all that means that our natural capital, which is the environment that we live in, is declining, and it's really rapidly declining in Australia, and that's frightening for me as a farmer. It should be frightening and really, really worrying for Australians generally. Lastly, farmers in the past, and probably even currently, have been part of the problem in relation to climate change, mainly with land use change, but also farming systems. We can change those things, and we are. And if we have a meaningful solution to climate change in Australia, then farmers must be part of the solution to climate change, either by hosting renewable energy, which is what I do on my farm. I have wind turbines on my farm. Also, and so the increased productivity through the income that you generate through that, but also through the opportunity to sequester carbon in soil, either through grasses or trees, and be paid for that that contribution to limiting climate change. So farmers have been part of the problem, but we also must be and we can be part of the solution. As I said, our vision is to change the farming systems in Australia. This is our Twitter handle, Farming Forever, and that's our vision, farming forever. It sounds unachievable, it sounds unrealistic, but if you think about it, agriculture is about 2,000 years old, or maybe longer than that. If we want a sustainable farming system, on the current populated Earth that we live on, we need to have an ability to produce food and fibre forever. And that's our vision. And that's about sustainable agriculture, which is part of our remit as well. So this is me. The details are there if you want to take a screen snapshot of that, or look at, just Google Farmers for Climate Action, you'll find us. And I'll move on now to the next step. So I'll stop sharing my screen and come back to you. Thanks, Henry, for this opportunity to tell a little bit about who and what Farmers for Climate Action are.
Thank you, Charlie. We'll have a big virtual round of applause for you, since we can't do it in person like we would have at Food in the Capital. But we're sending you good energy. That was a wonderful presentation, concise, and helped us understand what Farmers for Climate Action does. And I have some follow-up questions. I guess my first thing I wanted to just provide feedback on and say is I love that Farming Forever statement, because when we think about sustainability, a lot of people think of it as step, point A, point B, right? You kind of start here, make a plan, and then you achieve sustainability, when in fact, it's really a continual cycle of improvement. And I think no industry embodies that better than agriculture, where the farmers are constantly having to deal with these external factors and adapt, whether it's climate change or just the typical challenges that farmers face. So they have to constantly be in this kind of attitude of resilience and to create that sustainability where they can farm forever and make use of the land that they have. Because if they don't, they really suffer and they can't continue at all. So I think that agility, that adaptability, that resilience is already part of agriculture in general. So it's really exciting to see that you've kind of galvanized farmers across Australia to participate in this bigger mission of sustainability. So let's start off talking about you. Tell us a little bit about your farm. You said you have sheep farm, right? Is that correct?
That's right. Sheep. I run a few cattle as well, but mainly a sheep farming.
Okay.
We live on. You go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I guess so. Tell us a bit about your farm and kind of the volumes you're talking about, and how has climate change affected your farming activities directly?
One of the big issues in Australia that climate change is impacting on is water. Water, not the price or the value of water, but the availability of water. And I think this is a global challenge. My farm is situated on the head of the catchment area for the water supply for Sydney, which is the biggest city in Australia. It's, I think, about 5.5 million people live in Sydney. The water availability on my farm is seriously impacted by the increasing temperature, by the lack of rainfall, and by the ability of my land and the river systems on my land to absorb water. That is a consequence of how I manage my land. So this is getting into the climate smart agricultural area, where I need to be aware that if I overgraze my land and denude it, both of grass and trees, then I will be not allowing that land to absorb the rain that falls on it, or a significant potential of that. So it's really important for me to understand, and others, that those rainfall events are already changing, where we're getting much less and more intense rainfall events. So if your land is denuded, then you can't capture that water in the soil on your land, which inherently means that you're losing the carbon content of the soil because it's becoming compacted. And it means that the water that does run off my land is probably going to be polluted and not much use for the people that live downstream in Sydney. I became aware of the threat of climate change during the Millennium Drought, which was a very well documented drought in Australia, probably the first 7 or 8 years of this century. And as a consequence of my the scales falling away from my eyes, my Damascene moment, I understood that I had to change the way that I do farming on my farm, which I've done. Part of that has been by me going into a lease arrangement with a company, a Spanish company who put wind turbines on my land and 3 other adjoining farms that allowed me passive income from the wind turbines that is not weather dependent and allowed me to reduce the pressure that I was putting on my land, but environmentally and ecologically. So when we do get a rainfall event like we had in the last about 6 weeks ago, because my land is cared for and nurtured, that rainfall event, I was able to maximise the impact of the benefit of that rainfall event on my land. I did that by reducing my stocking numbers during the drought, pretty horrendous drought that we had in the last 12, 18 months in this area, much wider in Australia generally, which allowed me to maintain a viable farm with good ground cover and all the environmental and ecological benefits of that, and continue to produce food at the same time.
Thank you. So you talked about the climate smart farmer, and you've talked about several different activities that farmers do, whether it's your membership or yourself, to be more climate smart. But if you could kind of break it down to the simplest attributes, right? The simplest values and attributes of a climate smart farmer, maybe the top 3. You know, when we talk about leaders, we say, you know, they need to always be one step ahead, things like that. What are the top 3 attributes of a climate smart farmer so that our audience, which are farmers of all different kinds of scales, can start to think about what they need to do?
In the Australian context, as I said, I think the most critical impact, or the most critical issue, is water, both water availability from the sky from rainfall, but also water resources in the ground, aquifers and river systems and storage, dams as well on farm. That is the most critical aspect of that. And that means that we need, as I said earlier, to have soft, spongy soil that will absorb water, rainfall, especially as the rainfall becomes more intense. So there's that. Now that means some sort of less intensive agricultural system, whether that's regenerative agriculture, which is becoming a very well-known term, or whether that's reducing the amount of industrial farming that you do, the amount of industrial inputs that you use in farming, chemical inputs, fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, but also being aware of the changing climate. So the incidence of frosts, for instance, you need to be running a farm that is ensuring as much as you can, ensuring your farm from increasing severity and depth of frost seasons, length of frost seasons, but also, as we saw in the last summer, being able to reduce your farm's exposure and liability to intense heat events like we had in the last summer, bushfires as well. So there's those 2 aspects. Also, I think it's important to talk about the social aspect of this. When I talk about farming, I talk about family farming. So family-owned farms, not agribusiness corporation-owned farms. Because Australia is a highly centralised economy, population country. And if we want to have a diverse population that's spread around across the country, rather than at the moment a very highly populated, very high density population in the cities and very few people living in the country, then we need to have economically viable farms across the country, across the Murray-Darling Basin, which has been in the news a lot, all about water availability, but also who gets it. So equitable access to water, particularly also to agricultural techniques. So we're teaching people how to be aware of the threat of climate change, giving them the data, and then offering them opportunities, not telling them what to do, just saying, these are the alternatives that you have if you really want to make your farming system sustainable, as we said, sustainable forever.
So it sounds like one of the first steps is really looking at your local context and understanding what is the key resource or key driver for climate change in your context, or what is the key effect of climate change in your context. And in many parts of the world, it's going to be similar. It's going to be water. But in other parts of the world, it could really be more about soil degradation. It could be more about runoff of pesticides into and creating ocean acidification. So farmers that are really for climate action understand their impact and understand where they need to target their efficiencies. Would that be correct?
Yeah, very, very much nails it. There's no point putting fertilizer onto dry, barren landscape, for instance, because it's just going to end up in the oceans, as you said, or in the river systems. There's no point underutilising a resource, whether it's water or pasture or trees, or if you underutilise that resource, it's just as damaging as overutilising it. So you end up with weed infestations or feral animal infestations. So it's about a comprehensive management system that is ecologically sustainable as well as environmentally and economically sustainable and viable. I think there's a lot of debate about the ability of the earth to produce enough food to feed the burgeoning population of the planet. There's actually plenty of food. It's about the availability of that food.
Yeah.
About the ability of people to pay for that food. That's the problem. And that's all about equity and, as I said, sustainability. So
Yeah,
we're talking about social change here as well as agricultural change, which is a pretty scary issue for some people, particularly people that are facing the prospect of maybe having to adjust their lifestyles to be a bit more sustainable. I think actually COVID-19 is teaching us a whole lot about that right now around the planet.
Yeah, COVID-19 is certainly a wake-up call, and I think in some ways a sign of what's to come as we start to pay more of the consequences for our rapid and extreme overuse of resources on the planet. There's certainly more challenges to come. There's a graphic that's been going around the internet about flattening the curve around COVID-19, but that in the distance, there's this much larger curve with an apex, which is climate change. And so, what we learn from this experience, hopefully will prepare us for that. You talk a lot about being activists, and when people think about climate change activists, they think about Greenpeace hippies on a boat going for an oil pipeline or going for an oil rig, rather, I guess, if they're on the boat. And quite extreme, and really this game of winners and losers. You also talked about a just transition. And so when we look at the chart you presented, agriculture is about 12%, I think, of the impact on climate change in Australia, but there's other sectors that are much bigger. If we also think about agriculture typically has some of the thinnest margins. It's really a labor of love. It's a difficult industry to get started. A business to get started, it's difficult to operate. In contrast, things like mining sometimes can have enormous margins. And so how does your organization, balance that? I mean, farmers are in some ways the most challenged sector to be able to take risks and make sacrifices to impact climate change. And when these other sectors really abuse the planet in extreme ways for significant margins, how do you define a just transition? Should they pay more of the burden for climate change because of the history? How do you define a just transition in the context of those very, very difficult, balancing interests and balancing impacts?
That's a really critical question in Australia, because not just environmentally but economically, state budgets, particularly in New South Wales and Queensland budgets, are totally dependent on royalties from coal and gas, particularly coal. And if we're going to be serious about transitioning our systems away from fossil fuels, which include coal and gas, and most particularly oil, then we have to be serious about not leaving those workers stranded, not leaving them hung out to dry. And the workers in those industries, I know because I've met lots of workers in the renewable energy industry, which is a reasonably new industry in Australia. The job descriptions of the renewable energy people are very, very similar to the job descriptions of the people in the fossil fuel industry. They're engineers, they're electrical people, they're qualified in all sorts of engineering. it just takes the tweaking of a few dials for those people to be offered the opportunity, not only the opportunity, but the guarantee that their jobs are secure. It might not necessarily be the same job. In fact, it could easily be, and most often is, a much more environmentally friendly job. So instead of working in a mine, you're working out on a farm with a wind turbine or a few solar panels. To guarantee those people that their jobs are secure, there may be a little bit of relocation involved, but unless we leave those, if we leave those people behind, then what happened in the last federal election in Australia will happen again. Those people will vote against change, which is what happened in the last federal election in Australia. I think that is a critical part of the messaging that we give to farmers, is not to be worried about personal benefit for you. Be worried about your whole community, because all of the miners that live in regional Australia are part of those regional communities where the farmers live. So they're quite often sitting next to each other at the pub, particularly in the gas fields in Queensland, in the coal mines in New South Wales. Some of the other miners that are further west are not necessarily mining coal. Most of them are mining iron ore or valuable rare earth minerals. But in regional areas of New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland, even some of Western Australian communities, the farmers and the miners are sitting shoulder to shoulder playing tennis and rugby league and cricket with each other. So we need to have a compassionate view of this, an overall view that everybody is part of this change. We're not going to leave anybody behind. If we want the environmental benefits of not only of a better climate, which will help the animals as well as the people, but also gives us the opportunity to create a sustainable economic and environmental future, not just for us as Australians, but a model that can be rolled out across the planet. It's already been done in Europe, in England, in Britain. There was no talk of climate change during the whole Brexit debate, which has been up for 10 years or something. There's bipartisan support for climate action in every country in the world, pretty much, except for Australia and the United States. That'll change because the states in Australia and the states and cities in the US if you want, undermining the presidential decrees. The same thing is happening in Australia. There's a resistance at the federal level to shutting down the fossil fuel industry or even winding it back. That's being undermined, for want of a better term, by substantial action from cities and state governments in Australia, both in the energy space but also in the agricultural and mining space. So it's not unachievable, it's just a bit difficult. The more difficult it is, the more inclusive we have to be. And if we don't include everybody in this change, unfortunately, it won't happen.
So speaking of everybody, last question, what is the responsibility of consumers to be part of this initiative, to be climate activists in the face of agriculture, for example? What's your message to consumers?
It's pretty simple. Consumers need to be conscious of what they're buying. Food miles are important, so buy locally if you possibly can. Preferably go to a local farmer's market, or even pull into the farm down the road that's got an honesty box outside their front gate. So buy and consume consciously. So we've seen panic buying in Australia, I think around the world, from the COVID-19 outbreak. All of a sudden people have realised that they don't need to buy as much as they used to buy because they're throwing half of it away. So conscious consumers, but also in relation to food, but also in relation to energy. Have a look at the viability of buying a petrol car or a fossil fuel driven car next time you buy a car. Maybe, especially if you live in an urban environment, an electric car is a preferable option because you're not going to pay much for charging that car. Have a look at where you're buying your energy from, whether it's gas or electricity or coal even. Make sure it's sustainably sourced. If it's not, demand that it is. But there's one little, this is my final point, there's one little issue that every worker in Australia can have an impact on, and that's through their superannuation. Most of the superannuation companies, the massive trillions of dollars that are bound up in superannuation around the planet now, are looking for a home. because government bonds have gone through the floor because governments borrow lots and lots of money to address COVID-19. Superannuation holders, have a look at your portfolio, and then if you're not satisfied with where it's invested, or if you don't know where it's invested, which is probably the case, ask the question of your super manager, whether it's a fund or an individual, where is your investment? Is it safe? And if it's not, it needs to be made safe. And I can guarantee you the returns from infrastructure like renewable energy by far outweigh, both in return and security, the benefits of anything that's invested in anything to do with fossil fuels. There's no doubt that that's, we've already reached a tipping point for fossil fuels. It's on the decline. If your money's invested in a 30 or 40 year superannuation policy in fossil fuels, get it out of there as quickly as you can, because it's only going to reduce in value. That's a pretty hard decision to make right now because of the crashing of the share markets around the world. But sometime sooner or later, people are going to have to be conscious eaters, conscious purchasers of energy, and conscious investors through their superannuation or their personal wealth, whatever that may be.
Yeah, that's really an interesting point, Charlie. And for those of you that don't know the term superannuation in the US, it's really your pension fund. It's those large funds that you're kind of saving up your nest egg in. And so I always like to say, you know, when you're shopping or when you're investing, you're voting with your dollar. And so if you go directly to a farmer, you're saying, I value you, I want to give you more of the margin. If you're going for local or clean or farms that use less water, you're voting for that. So take the extra moment when you're making your shopping decision for a product, when you're making your shopping decision for food especially, and when you're making your investments, and think about how your vote is going to drive the industry forward, because consumers globally are the greatest power, and how we vote together is really going to change that world. And that's how you can be a climate change activist and encourage farming forever, as they say. So if you have ideas about how you can be a conscious consumer, how you can be better, feel free to put them in the comments here in this video and let us know what are some of the things that maybe we didn't mention that you think people should do as well, so you can share those ideas. I really want to thank Charlie Prell for this presentation. It was really fascinating to hear about your organization's work. I wasn't familiar, and I was really excited to hear about it. And certainly Australia, with its rich agricultural industry, is really, you know, primed to adapt to this. And we certainly hope those political issues will start to resolve themselves. If you want to meet Charlie in person, and myself as well, I definitely encourage you to go to Food in the Capital. It's Canberra's first ever sustainable food event. Canberra is the capital of Australia. They want to be leaders. They want to show that they are behind this action for climate change and driving it forward. So based on COVID-19, the event was delayed, but it's rescheduled now for the 17th to 18th of November. Definitely check the website for updates. You can see it up here, foodinthecapital.com.au. And you can see here, it's going to be covering all kinds of exciting events, from production to manufacturing, to community groups and policy. It's really one of those kind of diverse events that's covering all these various topics. Oh, and look, there I am there. There's my friend Mark. We've got some amazing speakers as part of this program. So a big thank you again to Charlie Prell. Charlie, where can we learn more about you? I guess we had that final screen, but just repeat the website again and where people can learn and support your organization.
Yeah, if you just have a look for Farmers for Climate Action on your search engine, whatever that may be. Can I just make one quick comment in relation to the political question that you raised?
Of course.
Don't wait for politicians to lead you, because they very, very rarely lead people, particularly on controversial issues. So don't wait for your politicians to lead you. Make it impossible for them not to follow you. Most really substantial social change comes from the ground up, not from the top down.
Great, thanks for that, Charlie. It's a great message to us all. And let's try one more thing, okay? This is gonna be fun. You're gonna say farming, and I'm gonna say forever, okay? And we'll end it that way, okay? so on three, on one, you're gonna go, okay? So 3, 2, 1.
Farming.
Forever.
Farming.
Forever.
Farming.
Forever. There you go. You heard it here. If you enjoyed
Thanks,
this.
Henry. Look forward to seeing you in.
Absolutely. Give us a like and
look forward to seeing you in November in Australia.
Yeah, it's going to be fun. Thanks so much, Charlie. Take care.
My pleasure.